So we had a conference here actually in 1993 to commemorate the 40th anniversary of this, called What is Life as well. And I got a book out of this. I edited this book with a guy called Mike Murphy, and it was Mike Murphy, a colleague of mine in biochemistry, who said that What is Life lecture happened in Trinity. Many of us weren't aware of that. We knew about the book, but we weren't aware it was done in Trinity. And we published a book, we edited a book with all these great speakers came to the conference. There was a conference proceedings. And just the impact, it was translated into 17 languages, amazingly, this proceedings of this event in 1993. And very importantly, we got all the people who spoke at it to sign the book. And this is the names that came here in 1993. And you see them here, they're all very famous people. John Maynard Smith, Stuart Kaufman, Roger Penrose, Christian Deduve, Stephen Jay Gould, Gerald Edelman, Jared Diamond, all of them, I got their signatures. This is before the days of eBay, I would have auctioned it by now. And that was the What is Life version in 1993. So that just shows you, all these people turned up. Me and Mike Murphy in our mid-20s invited them and they all came along, and it was a great celebration. Now I show this because one of the speakers, Jared Diamond, is a very famous writer. He wrote a great book called The Third Chimpanzee, you may have read it. And myself and Paddy Cunningham, for ESOF, invited Jared to come. And he wrote this nice letter back. He said, apologies, but I'm unable to accept your invitation. Are you the Luke O'Neill who organised the What is Life symposium in Trinity some years back? I remember at the dinner, your co-organiser reaching over and taking some of your food, a common sign of intimacy among primates. Did that person become your wife? And she did, and she's here somewhere, Margaret. There she is. A round of applause for Margaret. And at the time, my girlfriend, right? Now, Margaret was the official photographer of the event. And this is the Japanese translation. There's all the speakers. There's Margaret Worrell. They couldn't translate her name into Japanese. But there's all the speakers. So Jared Diamond is obviously a very peculiar man. We're very happy to get that letter from him. Now, let's get back to the matter in hand, though. In the book, What is Life? Schrödinger opens with this great sentence, really. He said he gave the lecture in Dublin. He points that out. And he said the subject matter was a difficult one, and the lectures could not be termed popular, even though the physicist's most dreaded weapon, mathematical deduction, would hardly be used. And he was a fantastic communicator. The book was written with crystal clear prose and inspired people like Jim Watson, Seymour Benzer, Leslie Orgel, Francis Crick. All of these great giants of molecular biology said they read the book and they were inspired. And of course, the question is what inspired him in the first place. There's the book, of course, when it came out. And it says in the page, you know, given in Trinity College Dublin. This is the 1943 edition. But what's interesting is Louis Le Brocq became a big friend of Schrödinger and turned up at the lectures and sketched a picture of Schrödinger during the lecture, which we couldn't get our hands on for this, sadly, but later on then did a beautiful, typical Le Brocq portrait. So Schrödinger was very popular in Dublin, many friends, many artists, including Le Brocq. And of course, here's a great picture, I think, from the Royal Irish Academy in 1942. Here's De Valera, here's Schrödinger, here's Paul Dirac, who won the Nobel Prize with Schrödinger outside the Royal Academy. There's a worrying number of priests here, you'll notice, in the background. But that was a conference that was held in Dublin when he can invite his friends. Now, this was the inspiration for What is Life. A paper had come out in 1938 by a guy called Max Delbruck, a very famous biochemist, molecular biologist. And in this paper, what they were doing is that they were irradiating fruit flies with radiation, fruit flies, and we heard about fruit flies yesterday from Jules Hoffman. And they were trying to quantify the smallest amount of radiation to cause a change in the phenotype, the trait of the fly. And they were able to have a small amount of radiation, and they got maybe the wings changed in the fly. And from that, they said a gene must be 1,000 atoms big, because that amount of radiation would cause a mutation in a molecule that size. Schrödinger read that paper and was inspired to give his lectures. And he says in What is Life, the target for which the ionization radiation is about 1,000 atoms big. We believe a gene to be an aperiodic crystal. Very important. He said a gene must be stable, so there must be a crystal. It must have information, so it's aperiodic, and that was the phrase he coined. And then he says it's the chromosome that contains some kind of code script, and that was the first time ever the term genetic code was used on this stage in 1943, and of course we now know the genetic code was the good way to describe this. Now mind you, the thing is, 2/3 of the book was not about genes at all, it was about thermodynamics. And he had this awful diagram. And that's been neglected, amazingly. The triumph of What is Life was DNA. The thermodynamics was kind of forgotten about, I guess, and people often forget that we've still work to do on the thermodynamics of living systems. And there's the structure of DNA that came out, of course, and then we had the famous Watson and Crick paper, and as I say, Jim will speak a bit later that describe the structure of DNA. But very importantly, Francis Crick writes to Schrödinger in Clontarf with a reprint of the paper. Isn't that amazing? And he says here, me and Watson, we were very influenced by What is Life. He said, we thought you'd be interested in the enclosed reprint. This is the key reprint of all biology and history. And he said, we think your term aperiodic crystal will be a very apt one, and that shows you the influence of this very important lecture that Schrödinger gave. Aperiodic crystal does describe DNA. Now, the last thing I want to say before we hand over to our honoured guest is, Flann O'Brien got involved inevitably, and he became friends with Schrödinger, and they kind of hit it off. And the third policeman, as you may know, involves the molecular exchange theory and so on. And in 1942, before the What is Life lecture, Schrödinger gave a public lecture on the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? And Flann O'Brien was in the audience. There was a second professor in the DIAS at the time in Celtic studies, because De Valera had two hobbies, Irish history and mathematics, and they appointed a chair in Celtic studies, a guy called O'Reilly, and Schrödinger. And O'Reilly spoke, he was an expert on St. Patrick. And he said there was a historical record that there were two St. Patricks, and this is true. One came from Rome, called Palladius, and one from Wales, called Patricius. And then Schrödinger gets up and he talks about the quantum world, the uncertainty of existence, you know. And the next day in the Irish Times, Flann O'Brien writes the funniest science joke on record. The Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, with its strange combination of Celtic history and cosmic physics, has proven there were two St. Patricks and no God. And I just find that very funny. And that's a round of applause for Flann O'Brien, even though he isn't here. What a wonderful phrase. So this just shows you the influence Schrödinger had.